Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my Old Testament survey. Going to be going over essentially what the story of the Old Testament is and how it was expressed to us and what was the purpose for the Old Testament. So let's begin by just going over some of the basics. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. It was glorious. It says in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Old Testament, that it was good and that God created man and it was very good. So since everything was good, everything was going to be great, right? Wrong. The reality is God created us with free will, the ability to do what it was we please. And unfortunately, with that free will, what we did was we went against and contrary to the law of God, to the way of God. The world actually rejected God, and we are part of the world. So what had to happen was God had to speak into the world and tell of his intentions of the world in a more explicit way. He did that by actually choosing one man through whom he's going to bless the entire world. And that's where the story of the Old Testament really starts to pick up with Abraham. Abraham was one of the patriarchs. This was the first person God had spoken to and said, I'm going to bless all nations through you. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had a son named Joseph. This is important because what ends up happening is from this small family ends up growing the entire people of Israel. And there's a really interesting story. I'm not going to get into too many specifics. I can't, just because it's so rich and there's so much depth. But this family ends up being in Egypt for a time to flee from a famine. And Joseph is the one that brings them to Egypt. He saves the family from famine. He saves the family from dying out. And while they're in Egypt, the family starts to grow. And 400 years after that, they grow to over 1 million people. They're incredibly strong, and the Egyptians are actually now afraid of them. So they've been enslaved to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are trying to suppress their power, trying to suppress that family, trying to suppress the line. God ends up hearing the cry of his people, of the family that's being suppressed. So God sends Moses. Moses spoke to God through the burning bush, and God said, go, let my people go. Get them out of Egypt. So Moses leads them out of Egypt, and he actually crosses the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, and they're able to escape slavery in such an incredible and powerful way. And they escape slavery, they escape Egypt. I love this little design. It's so wonderfully simplistic. They leave Egypt, they cross through the sea on dry ground, and everything's great, right? They're going to get to where they need to go and everything's going to be fantastic. No, they actually wander in the Sinai Peninsula or the desert for 40 years. If they wanted to get from where they were in Egypt to the Promised Land, which is up here, it would actually take roughly 11 or 12 days. It took them 40 years because they didn't have the faith to enter into the land. Ultimately, when they mustered up the courage, they mustered up the faith, they crossed through the Jordan River here and started to go over their conquest of the land of Canaan, which is the land God promised them. He promised this land to Abraham so that all of the family could live there. So that they get there, everything's great, right? Happily ever after, they're in the land God promised them? Not exactly. God actually spoke through these prophets, telling the people of Israel, Abraham's descendants, if you want to stay in the land, you have to obey my commandments. Do you think Israel does that? No, just like the rest of us, they disobey God. So what ends up happening is after Israel had established this incredible kingdom, this incredible line in the land of Canaan, they end up getting taken out of the land of Canaan. And this is what we call the exile. Once they're exiled for 70 years, roughly, they end up coming back, and the people are just left to wonder, what are we going to do after that? So that's essentially the basic story of the Old Testament, and it's broken down in several ways. It's called the Tanakh by the Jews. TA standing for Torah, which is the law. It's essentially the beginning books, that history that I told you earlier. The Nevi'im, or the prophets, and this goes over a little bit more of the history when they get into the land of Canaan. And then what ends up happening is you have the Chetuvim. You have all these writings that take place throughout this history. You have prophets speaking into and to the people of Israel throughout this history, telling them the word of God, telling them how to obey properly. And unfortunately, they fall short, they don't do it, and they experience the consequences. This isn't the happily ever after book that many people think of. But the entire purpose of the Old Testament was to have the prefiguring of Christ, to show throughout the Old Testament that man cannot save himself. So he actually needs someone to come save him. That someone is the Messiah. And that's when the New Testament comes in. That's my presentation.